Welcome to another episode of On the History Trail. I'm your host and tour guide, Mark Nonestied. On today's episode, we are going to learn about the history of the Old Bridge Speedway and discuss recent efforts by a group of citizens to preserve the stories and artifacts of this racetrack. We're also going to take a look at a vintage modified stock car that raced at the Old Bridge track. Racing has a long history in central New Jersey. Before the advent of automobiles, horse racing was a popular pastime dating back to the 1700s. Local racetracks sprung up in communities throughout Middlesex County. One such track was located in East Brunswick, near, well, appropriately enough, Racetrack Road. By the 1910s, automobiles were replacing horse-drawn modes of transportation, and fast race cars became all the rage. Well-known racers competed in the area, such as Indianapolis 500 pioneer Ira Vale, who won the first auto race at the Flemington Fairgrounds in 1915, and Bob Robinson of Daytona Beach, who raced at the Woodbridge Speedway in the 1920s. The Old Bridge Speedway was part of this racing heritage, and on today's episode, we're going to speak with racing historian Earl Krause about the history of the racetrack. We will also speak with Ray Shea about his efforts to restore a vintage modified stock car. So, gentlemen, start your engines and sit back and relax and follow me as we travel on the History Trail. Well, Earl, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We know that New Jersey has a very rich automobile racing history dating back really to the infancy of automobiles.
Right.
What were some of the early tracks and where were they located?
Well, one of the very historic tracks in New Jersey was a dirt speedway going back to the early era of 1915, 1920s, the Flemington Speedway.
Okay.
And it was in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. It was a fairgrounds. And that was one of the earliest tracks that attracted nationally known drivers who ran the Indianapolis 500, which was in its infancy then as well.
Yeah.
And they would come to Flemington. And there were two board tracks in New Jersey, one in Woodbridge, where the site of the Woodbridge High School is now.
Huh.
And there was another track in Nutley, New Jersey called the Nutley Velodrome.
Huh.
And it was actually a bicycle track, a bicycle velodrome. And they boarded midget racing cars, high-powered midget race cars. And these were driven as well by Indianapolis 500 drivers. And this was in the 1930s.
Huh. And so when you say a board track, what are we talking about? These are wooden board tracks?
Yes.
Huh. So
exactly.
that's sort of hard to imagine that these early tracks are constructed entirely out of wood?
Right. They were either dirt tracks like Flemington or board tracks. Paved tracks really didn't come into focus until the era of the 1940s, really.
What's the benefit then of the wood track versus the dirt track? I mean, is it more traction for it, or is there a reason for that?
It was actually safer because the dirt tracks of that time were they were almost like a fairgrounds horse track, and they were rutted and there would be holes and a lot of dust. When they actually put together these board tracks, which were very, very well constructed, they were very high speed, but they were very safe for racing.
And what types of cars would have raced on these tracks in the 20s and teens and 30s era?
Well, again, a track like Nutley, the Nutley Velodrome, they had these high-powered midget cars, which were scaled down, sort of like Indianapolis cars, but very much scaled down. And at tracks like Flemington or Woodbridge, the same type of cars that would run in Indianapolis would come in and run on those tracks.
So you mentioned these are nationally recognized tracks, so I'm assuming they're attracting nationally recognized racers. Who are some of the well-known race car drivers from that time period that operated in or that raced in New Jersey?
Well, drivers like Ira Vale, who was very well known throughout the country, he would come into New Jersey. A fellow named Tommy Hintershitz from Pennsylvania was one of the great legendary competitors. He would come in and race. There was a driver named Ted Horn who was nationally known, and he actually established his base of racing operations in a place called Gasoline Alley in Patterson, New Jersey. And a fellow named Roscoe Pappy Huff, who was one of the leading race car mechanics, drivers, and car owners. He actually had a fleet of cars that he had with top drivers, and he had his base of operations in New Jersey. He was actually from Indiana, Pappy Huff, and he heard about all the great racing in New Jersey, and he actually reestablished his base of operations in Paterson.
Huh. Interesting. So these tracks must have brought in tremendous numbers of people to...
They did.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so the Old Bridge Speedway, how does that fit within this racing heritage? What time period is that from?
Well, Old Bridge Stadium actually opened in 1953. It was built over the winter of 1952 and into 53. And the founding family, they were racing enthusiasts, and they were actually, some of them were actually part of racing teams in the time. And they looked around and they saw how successful auto racing was nationally and in New Jersey. And they thought, well, let's build a racetrack. And they went around to different places and got ideas how to build a state-of-the-art, for its time, half-mile paved oval. And that's how Old Bridge actually came to be.
So this was a paved track then?
Yes, half-mile paved oval.
And where was it located?
Actually, it was called, at that time, Old Matawan Road, which was the original Route 18 in the Browntown area of Old Bridge.
And so who were some of the early racers, race car drivers that raced at the Old Bridge Speedway?
The very first winner in August 1953 was a gentleman named Ray Brown, who was from White Plains, New York, and he was a top modified stock car driver. The modified stock cars were the prime division at Old Bridge for many years. Ray Brown was a top runner in that division out of state, and he came down for the opening race, driving for a gentleman from the Jersey Shore area named Carl Gardella, who was one of the top race car owners. And then you had drivers like Pete Frazee, who was from Rahway, who became the all-time leading winner at Old Bridge Stadium. A driver named Joe Kelly from Pennsylvania, who came down to Old Bridge and won many races. There was a driver they used to call the Wild Man. His name was Elton Hildreth from South Jersey, from Bridgeton, New Jersey, and he had won a lot of races in that region. He would come up to Old Bridge and invade. And you had many drivers from New England, from New York State, and other parts of Pennsylvania who would come down. But New Jersey had its own great group of racers, such as Wally Dellenbach Sr. from East Brunswick, who went on to compete in the Indianapolis 500. And many national drivers ran at Old Bridge as well. Drivers like Parnelli Jones, Richard Petty, Mario Andretti, they all stopped in at various times.
And so what kind of cars are they racing? You mentioned the modified stock cars. What type of car is that?
The modifieds of that time, and there is still modified stock car racing today, but it's evolved into a state-of-the-art race car. When Old Bridge first opened and through its life through the 1960s, they used basically pre-World War II body cars, the coupes and sedans, and they would base them on a 1950s style chassis, and they would put in a high-performance motor. Most of the parts, of course, the car bodies themselves, the chassis, they would come from junkyards, and an inspiring race car driver would go there and get the material he needed and build the car and bring it to the track.
So some of it sounds like it could be a real sort of grassroots effort here. I mean, could anybody race a car if they... Basically,
yes. Old Bridge and many other tracks of that time, they established what was called a novice division for beginner racers. And that was the basic ladder. You would start off in a novice stock car that you built and get experience in that car, and then move up into the modified or sportsman division. It was a sportsman class, which was basically the same as a modified, except the motor was a little less powered. But that was basically the same type of race car. And drivers who ran the sportsman division and the modifieds were considered the professionals of that time. And Old Bridge also had a outstanding drag racing track. Right on the home stretch of the oval, they set up a drag strip. The Speedway for stock car racing would run on Friday or Sunday nights, and on Saturday evening they would have drag racing on a short drag strip. and many local competitors would run there. And again, the Old Bridge drag strip was one of the most well-known throughout the Northeast area.
Huh, wow. Now, let's talk about some of the safety features of these early, or lack of safety issues with these early tracks. I mean, I've seen old photographs of some of these speedways where people are literally just sort of sitting right on the guardrail by the track. I mean, was that common back in those days?
It was early on, Mark. By the time Old Bridge opened, the state of New Jersey, just as it is today, had become very involved with auto racing because it was such a booming sport in the state, and there were a lack of safety regulations back then. So New Jersey State Motor Vehicle Department, through the state police, they actually began to regulate auto racing. They set all the rules in coordination with the tracks, and they do that today as well. They establish all the safety rules. You mentioned in the early days, it was very common for the spectators to stand right alongside the track. By the early 1950s, and certainly as that decade evolved, all tracks had to have catch fences, like protective fencing in front of the grandstands. The spectators actually had to be in a protected area. And the state police, the motor vehicle, they would also regulate the guardrails at the tracks. Although the safety equipment that the drivers wore back then was rather rudimentary, they still had to wear helmets, and there was protective equipment inside the race cars, including seat belts, and it was very strict for its time. It was an evolving process.
So some of these safety concerns, I'm assuming, come about because there are accidents or tragic events that happen. I mean, did any of that happen at the Old Bridge Speedway?
Old Bridge had one fatal crash early on with stock car racing, and it was a driver named Bob Kammerer from Spotswood. And this was in 1954, right at the end of that particular racing season. And sadly, he was involved in a fatal crash. His car turned over, and he received injuries that proved fatal. But throughout all the years that Old Bridge ran, again from 53 through 1968, and all the hundreds of races and laps that were run there, there were really no other fatalities. It was a very safe speedway. It was designed for safety. It was a big wide track, and drivers could get out of trouble very easily, so, but highly competitive.
So who are sponsoring the race cars? I mean, some of the well-known race car drivers, I'm assuming, had well-known sponsors, but for local individuals, I mean, are they being sponsored by a local gas station or?
Exactly. Pete Frazee, who I mentioned, he drove his signature car at Old Bridge was a number 41, which came out of the Keysby area of Woodbridge. It was owned by Race's Garage, which is still in operation today, and they were the owner and main sponsor of that car. There was a garage in Old Bridge called Beatles Garage, Bill Beatles Garage. They had race cars, and that Bill Beatles Garage, which was very close to the Speedway, was actually a gathering point for racers on the weekends. Drivers would work on their cars there. Bill Beatle himself, who owned the gas station, he had a race car, but he used to welcome the racers there to work on their cars, including the ones who came from out of state. If they had a problem at the racetrack, maybe a breakdown or an accident, he'd open up the garage and let them work on their cars.
And so who owns the track itself? I mean, is it a family or a company that owns the speedway itself?
It was a family named was Edelson, actually founded the track. And over the years, this is where it gets sketchy as far as the history. They essentially kept the ownership of the track. After the first couple of years, it seemed like they lost interest in actually promoting it to run it as a racetrack. And they would lease out the track on a yearly or multi-year basis to different promotional groups. And many well-known racing promoters and organizers in Northeast racing would come in and run the track. But that was sort of what led to its eventual downfall. Whereas you know, racetracks today are run by families or business organizations who promote the track and you know, work with the community. Because Old Bridge Stadium was actually being leased out constantly, the racing was continually outstanding. There was never a question there, but there was never any continuity. And as the 1960s were going along, the housing in the area was beginning to develop more. And I believe, and again, this is where it gets questionable as to what exactly happened, the people who owned the land where the track was probably looked at it and said, we can make more selling this for housing and development in that booming time than running it as a racetrack, because they were paying taxes obviously on the land and so forth. So, and we believe that's pretty much what led them to close the track down after 1968.
So when's the last race? When does that run?
August 1968, and it was a driver from Long Island named Fred Harback, who was one of the top drivers from the Long Island circuit, and he would come into Old Bridge and race, very popular competitor. He was one of the top drivers where he never won a race at Old Bridge until that last night. The very last, it turned out to be the last race of the track, and he actually ended up winning it. But he was a big winner in Long Island, and later on he came back to New Jersey and ran at tracks like New Egypt Speedway and won a lot of races there. Yeah, Fred Harback was the very last driver to win, and that race was actually not scheduled to be the last race. It was run in August of '68, as I mentioned, and the plans were at that time for the track to open again in 1969, but it never did. No one ever came back to open the gates, and that was the end.
So is that one of the last speedways in central New Jersey to operate? I mean, was Flemington still around then, or?
Flemington was going strong at that time. Preceding Old Bridge Stadium was a track that is still operating today very successfully, Wall Stadium at the New Jersey shore. That had opened in 1950. And Wall Stadium was and is a third-mile high-banked speedway, as opposed to Old Bridge being a half-mile. And that formed a circuit, by the way. Drivers who would run at Old Bridge on Sunday night or Friday night would run at Wall Stadium on Saturday.
So what's at the site today? If we were to visit where this speedway was, what would we find today?
The Whispering Pines Housing Development, kind of an ironic name.
Yeah, right.
And I've been back there, Mark, and of course, I've been to the track so many times in my youth that if you go into the housing development and you let your mind's eye kind of look around, you can actually make out where things were at the track, where the tree lines were, and different things in the housing area. You can look around and say, okay, I know where the first and second turn were and the pit area was. So, yeah.
And what are people doing today to preserve the history of the Speedway?
Organizations such as the Garden State Vintage Stock Car Club do a marvelous job of preserving that history through restoring race cars that actually ran at that track and others, through archiving priceless racing photos and stories and memorabilia that were part of it. Organizations such as that do the job very well. And they have racing reunions and gatherings of the people who ran there, and the drivers, the team owners, the fans all get together and tell some great stories. So it's really nice. And what some members of the club will do, they'll painstakingly build a exact replica of a car that raced at a track like Old Bridge, using the old diagrams and notes that they had, so much that you can't really tell it's a replica.
Well, Ray, thank you for being on the show and bringing up this modified stock car. What time period does this date to?
This particular car and this configuration raced from the early 70s until 1976, 77.
Okay, so it was a racing car in the 70s, but it looks like it's an older vehicle originally.
Originally, the first construction was in 1963.
Okay.
A man by the name of Nick Catone built the car.
Okay.
And there was a different body on it, and the chassis is changed all except for the center part of the car. It's been changed over the years.
Okay.
Then the car went to Long Island, and Tom Baldwin, his son is a crew chief in NASCAR now. He raced it on Long Island for the early 70s through 74.
Okay. But the body of the car is older, though. What time period is that
It's a 1937 Plymouth body, coupe body.
So initially the body started out as a regular stock...
It was a stock car. They found a body in the woods. The roof was all caved in from kids jumping up and down on it. And they cut it down, they mounted it on the body, which was what they did back in the day.
Okay.
That's the only real stock part of the car. The rest is all custom built.
Okay.
Suspension, the frame is all put together by the builder. So they're pretty sophisticated even back in that day. It's got Chrysler torsion bar suspension in the bottom with Lincoln control arms on the top.
Okay.
So guys made their own setups back then.
So this was common then, I guess, in the 50s and 60s and
Very
70s.
common.
You're taking cars that are 15 or 20 years older and modifying them to race on these racetracks. Do we know if this raced on the Old Bridge Speedway?
It actually did race in the early 60s at Old Bridge.
Okay. So what are some of the modifications that they would have done to the car at that time?
Well, what they done is they took a Chevrolet frame,
Okay.
and they put it together underneath the Plymouth body. They built the roll cage, and like I say, they designed this Chrysler suspension out of a 5960 Chrysler car, and it's got 59 Lincoln upper control arms.
Okay.
The motor is set back in the chassis. It's a 427 big block Chevrolet, bored out to 440 cubic inches. With the engine set back, you can see where the seat is now moved back almost to the back seat of the original car.
Okay, so if we look inside of it, yeah, we can see that the steering wheel does come back quite a bit, and the seat is, like you said, would have been the back seat of the original car. And the controls on it, the controls are
simple, just like a regular car. You have your throttle and your brake and your clutch.
Okay.
And 4-speed transmission.
And have you raced this car?
I actually drove this car in 1976 at Wall Stadium. Wall Stadium in New Egypt.
What sort of speeds can this car do?
Depends on the size of the track. At Wall Stadium, they're probably doing close to 100 top speeds, a third of a mile, high bank track. I take it to New Hampshire now for the vintage events, and we hit around 140 up there with it.
What does it feel like to be in a car like this going 140 miles an hour?
Well, you really don't know you're going that fast. They say you don't know you're going fast till you hit something. Because everybody's going the same speed, so that you really don't have a relation to the speed you're going.
Okay.
But it's cool.
And what are some of the safety features? I mean, I guess there has to be some sort of safety features on it if a car's going that fast.
Well, you have a 5-point harness.
Okay.
Seatbelt system. Like that here, which the state mandates you replace every 2 years.
Okay.
You have your helmet, fireproof uniform, fireproof underwear, shoes, socks, and gloves, which is mandatory in New Jersey.
How about in the 60s and 70s? I mean, what sort of gear were they using then?
Short sleeve T-shirts and dungarees. We didn't know any better.
Yeah.
I actually, in 1962, there weren't fire suits as we know them today. And I, as a kid, used to watch the Indy drivers. They always had these nice white uniforms on. So I thought I'd be cool, and I went to my local Army Navy store and I bought a pair of painter's coveralls, which were cotton. Now you can imagine what would happen if I got in a fire.
Right.
So, well, we didn't know any different back then.
Yeah. Ray, we were talking about safety features with the cars and also with what the drivers wore, and you have some of the safety features that were used or the equipment that was used over the years. Let's start off with some of the earlier equipment here.
This is my helmet from 1962.
Okay.
This is the goggles we use. Or pretty much just a shell here. There's really wasn't a lot of protection. Keep you from getting a headache maybe, but that's pretty much what your helmet was back in then. Before this, they had the Cromwell, which was made out of paper mache, wasn't it? So you had helmets made of paper. Figure that out. So.
And how about the outfit itself? What sort of?
This is a uniform from the 1970s, early 70s. It's a single layer. It's pretty light. One-piece suit, which is mandatory in New Jersey.
So this is a flame retardant?
It's a flame retardant. So pretty light.
What about the shoes?
Shoes, these are the boots that I used to race with in the 60s and 70s. Just regular suede boots, I guess you call them. And then...
so how about today? Let's
today,
see how things have changed.
Today you have your fireproof shoes, which is all mandatory. You got fireproof gloves. You have the underwear, as I mentioned.
So they have fireproof underwear that they're putting on.
Put your underwear top and bottom, then you have socks, fireproof socks, and your gloves. And then you have this suit, which is about, what, 10 times as heavy as the other one?
Wow. Huh.
This is a double layer fireproof suit.
What a difference between the two. And so in a matter of just a couple decades, they went from these...
the burn time that you can stay in a fire is probably 7 to 10 seconds with all this gear on.
Really? Huh.
It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's crucial.
Yeah, I would imagine. And how about the bottoms? Are they designed?
The bottoms are designed here so the fire can't go up the pant leg.
Huh. So they've got a piece that's sewn in.
And this goes your foot here. So you feel pretty confident, safety-wise, driving today. And of course, your new helmet.
And so the helmets too are a world of difference.
Quite a difference from the original one. Very well padded inside. It fits very snug.
And is there a neck brace as well that they're wearing?
You have to wear some kind of a neck device, either a minimum of a collar or a Hans device, which is $700 to $800 or more.
Huh. And the years that you've been racing, did you ever have an accident or?
I've had, I don't want to. Yeah, I've had accidents. I've never been injured racing other than a dislocated thumb. I've had several flips. 5 times at Wall Stadium. One year I rolled a car. A car was destroyed, but I got out okay. And your usual trips into the guardrail, stuff like that.
I mean, so thankfully that there are these safety features to protect the drivers.
And a well-built car too is important too.
Great. Well, Ray, I want to thank you for bringing in the car and sitting here and talking with us about the history of it.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Earl, you're involved in the racing industry today. In what capacity?
I tell you, I'm very. It's very enjoyable. You know, talking back like we did, how I went to the races as a youngster, to be able to do a racing career now is wonderful. I never had a desire to drive a race car, other than most kids sitting in the grandstand at a racetrack thought, boy, this would be neat to do. I always watched the announcer, watch and listen to the announcer, and thought that's what I'd like to do someday. And I'd actually come home from the racetrack and I'd write a racing story about what I saw on a yellow pad. And I often thought, boy, I wish I still had those. But what it evolved into is I am now a columnist and news editor with Area Auto Racing News. We're based in Trenton, New Jersey. It's a family-owned newspaper that covers auto racing in the Northeast and around the country. All the local speedways, including NASCAR and Indianapolis car racing. And I'm also an announcer at Pocono Raceway for the NASCAR events and at tracks such as Wall Stadium. And I also do guest announcing at various speedways. And I'm also very proud to be a trustee with the board of the Garden State Vintage Stock Car Club. Because of my love for racing history, I love to work with that group and help to preserve our history. It's such a key part of our lives.
Great, Earl. Well, thank you for coming in and sharing these stories and talking to us about the history of the Old Bridge Speedway.
Thank you so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode of On the History Trail as we spoke with Earl Krause and learned about the rich automobile racing heritage at the Old Bridge Speedway, and with Ray Shea about his efforts to preserve a unique piece of racing history. For comments or suggestions about this episode or other shows, please visit our website at ebpl.org/EBTV. Thank you for watching, and come along again as we travel on the History Trail.